Welcome back to another episode of The Close Read, our Claremont Review of Books podcast, in which every time we publish an issue of the CRB, I sit down with some authors from the latest issue and just get a little bit more in depth on the questions that they raise in their essays and so forth. Well, I'm very excited. My guest today is Professor Richard Samuelson, a friend of mine and a frequent contributor to various Claremont outlets. Richard is an associate professor in American history at California State University, San Bernardino, and he specializes there in the American Revolution. In fact, he's currently working on a book about John Adams's political and constitutional thought. His working title, he informs me, is Adams and the Republic of Laws. I'm looking forward very much to reading that once it's out. But we're here today to chat with Professor Samuelson about his essay in the latest CRB. It's called Cancel the New York Times, and we actually pre-released it. We previewed it on The American Mind and then opened it up early to our readers on the Claremont Review of Books website because we thought it was particularly timely and extremely attention-grabbing. It's got a lot of play online, and it's one, I think, of the gems of the issue. I'm just going to read a little bit from the opening of this essay before I leap into talking with Professor Samuelson. So here we go. This is a quote from this essay. The left's cultural revolution is in one of its periodic Jacobin phases. Statues defaced, beheaded, burned, and torn down. Streets and schools and other things renamed. Public spaces occupied by gun-wielding thugs. The iconoclasm has spread from attacks on Confederate monuments to statues of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Christopher Columbus, Ulysses S. Grant, Catholic saints, and even white abolitionists. New York's American Museum of Natural History is taking down its famous Teddy Roosevelt statue. Professor Samuelson, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You set up at the opening of this essay, you set up the kind of situation that at this point, anybody that reads the news will be somewhat aware of what's going on in American streets, but not everybody knows just how bad it's gotten. And then to me, you launch into what is vintage Samuelson. It's erudite, it's witty, it's tongue-in-cheek. You have this suggestion that we should rename the New York Times. If we're in the business of renaming things, if we're in the business of canceling and tearing down statues, the New York Times should be first on the list. Why? Can you give us a quick pitch for renaming the New York Times?
Well, if we're renaming things that have connection with slavery, New York Times is named after New York, and New York got its name when the English conquered the Dutch outpost in New Amsterdam, and they rechristened it New York after James, Duke of York, the brother of King Charles II. And together they created the Royal African Company, reconstituting a previous corporation. And the purpose of that was to take over the slave trade from the Dutch. So in other words, the New York Times is named after one of England's great slave traders. I can't see how the woke New York Times reporters aren't offended in papers each time they walk into the New York Times building, or even when they take the subway out of Times Square, which now I think they have to walk a block or two now from that subway station to get to the building.
Right. This is great. I mean, the joke about this is that it's not a joke, that what the argument you're making is perfectly consistent with the logic of what in the period of the Roman Empire we would call damnatio memoriae, right? This kind of damnation of the memory of any injustice of the past. Mm-hmm. As I was rereading your piece before we went on the air, it occurred to me to ask, why do you think that this argument has not come up in leftist circles? What is it that prevents people who are making this argument about George Washington from making it about the New York Times?
I don't know, or about New York.
Yeah.
It's it could be it just hasn't hit yet, but it could be the same reason why the blackface issue doesn't seem to affect the Governor Northam of Virginia. That is, it's only when it seems to be directed at people who are not wired into the Democratic establishment, more or less. That's not actually entirely true, but it could be that it hasn't hit the Times because it is seldom reflexive that the standards have to apply across the board. Because if the standards applied across the board, people would soon realize they're ridiculous. They're being used and they would end, right? It's one thing to go after Confederate statues. As I believe Senator Cotton said, look, it should just be done by a democratic process if we're going to change public icons and public names. And there's a case for that every now and then, sure. But that's different from what you now have is mobbing and people who are just kind of rolling through and tearing down whatever they think might feel offensive. Sometimes they don't even know what they're doing, I assume. I don't know why they would tear down monuments to Black Union soldiers in the war, for example. I think some of them have been attacked in the Civil War, that is. So one wonders what exactly they're doing. And also, I think historically, particularly youngish men, it's kind of fun to mob, right? And so it kind of steamrolls out of control. That's the problem with it.
When I say that this is an essay that kind of an argument that plays to many of your strengths, I think too few writers on the right kind of understand how humor works as an argumentative tactic. What you say, that if you were to apply this logic consistently, it would be ridiculous, is precisely the reductio ad absurdum you're going for here, right? The selectivity of the way these attacks get made, and the plainness of just how kind of politically motivated they are. I'm reminded here of that now famous, notorious clip of Biden saying, "If you don't vote for me, you ain't black," right? This kind of politicized redefinition of all of these identity groups. Do you think so? The classic, or the now kind of classic argument on the right about this is that it's kind of a Soviet practice, that the redefinition of the word fascist, for example, from the 30s has now basically been just applied to every major hot button word with political valence. Does the Soviet argument ring true for you? Do you think there's a different kind of ideological heritage here?
Well, the Soviet argument is that's our first reference. If you look at the French Revolution, you had a whole bunch of iconoclasm, statues being torn down, churches being desecrated, and they reconsecrated one to the goddess Reason. John Adams really thought that was egregious.
Yeah.
Don't call it the age of reason. The real faculty has nothing to do with it. Better call it the age of pain. That's what they're doing. It's lots of pain. And you go all the way back. He actually wrote a history of the French Revolution by a Society of Latin Writers, when he takes clips from they take a paragraph from Tacitus, a paragraph from Livy, etc., and give you basically the narrative from the storming of the Bastille to the rise of Napoleon, and say, none of this is surprising. Human beings follow patterns, right? And so our point of reference perhaps is a little too shallow there if we say it's only Soviet, but that's certainly part of it. It is, and because there is, the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement, the internal group running it, are Marxists. So that would be a direct connection with the Soviets, of course.
That's a really good point. As a matter of intellectual history, there is some direct reference going on here to Marxian thought and to Soviet practices. But to the point of another essay in this issue, actually, by Angelo Codevilla about the millenarian spirit, that the concerns Adams articulates about the French Revolution are concerns more broadly about a kind of philosophical trend that pops up from time to time in periods of strife in the West. And I want to get in now, actually, to your sort of more philosophical concerns. You get serious pretty quickly in this essay after having raised the question of why haven't we renamed the New York Times, and you begin to make, I think, a really cogent argument against the underlying premises of the 1619 project, the New York Times' sort of new anti-American screed. And you really take Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author, the architect of the project, at her word about this sort of argument that racism is in the DNA of our country. I'll read just the introduction to that, and then I want to get into with you kind of some of the implications of your argument here. You say, history is, of course, more complicated than partisans would like it to be. And those complexities have much to teach about today's 1619 riots, as Charles R. Kessler called them recently in the New York Post. He notes that the New York Times seized upon 1619 as the year for their rewrite of U.S. history because that's the year the first slaves arrived in Virginia. Racism is, in the words of Nicole Hannah-Jones, the reporter the Times put in charge of the 1619 project, in the very DNA of this country. But DNA, Kessler notes, is something that cannot be changed. Hence, the rhetoric of the 1619 project is the rhetoric of futility. Like bringing democracy to Iraq or a sense of humor to Presbyterians, ending racism in the U.S. from this point of view is impossible. Now, Richard, as a Presbyterian myself, I'm offended by this, but maybe that's because I don't have a sense of humor. But no,
I got a little pushback on that here and there. Yes.
No, but you're not wrong. I mean, I couldn't claim from my regular Sunday experience that this is an unfair jibe.
Just briefly, that's part of the problem we have. We can't distinguish between what's a trivial joke and what's a serious case of bigotry. And I think to have a healthy culture is where you can joke in a lighthearted way about the foibles of different groups, because there are groups and they do have tendencies. And the difference between that and saying they're stupid or mean or evil.
Yeah. I was just chatting with some of the guys at the American Mind about this, that this is fundamentally, especially in America, one of the central ways we acknowledge each other's differences while letting each other know that we're kind of okay with them, is making fun. I mean, and actually, I think this is a specifically male thing in some ways. I remember in high school that whenever I revealed something different or weird about myself, I knew it was going to be okay once my buddies made fun of me for it. That's when you know. And yeah, I think that the loss of that is a great tragedy. But can you speak to some of these? You raise a number of kind of interesting historical concerns about the 1619 narrative, having primarily to do with the definition of slave and the definition of racial caste. Can you just articulate some of those for our listeners?
Yeah. The basic point is we don't know exactly what happened in 1619. The evidence seems to be that the slaves who were purchased were no longer slaves once they were owned by or brought into Virginia. To have slavery, you need a law of slavery, the institutions of slavery, and the culture of slavery, which they did not, in fact, have yet, right? Those had to be built. So you have good scholars from Edmund Morgan, particularly several decades ago, to others more recently, Painter. They point out that no, they probably weren't slaves until after 1660, as we understand the term, right? And in addition to that, you didn't have the conception of race that we now have. Race, until roughly the time of the American Revolution, was a term interchangeable with tribe or people or something. It didn't have its biological connotation. And what's interesting now is, I think in our discourse today, we're forgetting that, because there's almost nobody. There are people, Richard Spencer notoriously, there are people who believe that there are biological races, but they are very, very few. But we still have this whole discussion and discourse of racism, and we have the difficulties based on the legacy of race and racism. But even now, the most interesting thing to me, or one of the most interesting turns, is on campuses, you now have the rise of what's called ethnic studies. And there's now a requirement for it in California. And ethnicity was always classically, well, a national group comes to America, they're called an ethnicity. So from Italians to Poles to Japanese to Colombians to Mexicans, Nigerians, those would be ethnicities in the US context. Now, ethnicity means what race used to mean. And you don't, at least according to academics. Right? So go back, I think that's what, on that line is where the tensions you have in the 1619 project and in modern discussion of race. So go back to 1619, none of that really exists yet. Africans, many of them, it seems, if they converted to Christianity, they ceased to be, they were definitely considered free and equal, or potentially. They might have been servants who had to serve a number of years like white indentured servants. And keep in mind, in Virginia, servitude was much worse than it was in England. So Edmund Morgan notes it was much more like slavery. It went on for many more years. The punishments were much more harsh. And you were essentially treated as a being whose job was to labor. That is, if your master died, your contract ended when you were in England. If your master died in Virginia, they said, go find another master to serve out the remainder of your time. So you were a creature that owed time, right? So the movement is towards something like the practice of slavery in the context of white servants. And that took several decades to ramify through. And then when Virginia settles down, it gets more healthy. And also Pennsylvania opens up. So if you're a white servant, you want to go to Pennsylvania, it's a much better deal. And so then you start importing lots and lots of Africans to Virginia in the decades between 1660 and up to 70, sometime in the 18th century. And then you get the creation of the distinction between black and white as a matter of law, and the distinction between slave and servant. But those don't exist in 1619. They are created in live time in the several decades after 1619, and really they don't exist right away. So 1619 is not a reasonable year to peg much of anything on from a historical point.
No, it's fascinating, and it sort of gets at the complexity or the incoherence of talking about these things as both the sort of early racists of the colonies would have done, and as our sort of modern racialists, our identity politicians and so forth do, talking about these things in terms basically of kind of aesthetic properties of skin color or some visible, recognizable outside thing. I recently, as one should never do, I got into a sort of doom scrolling, as they call it, when you find a Twitter thread that really looks terrible and you say, oh gosh, what are the replies to this going to be? So somebody had tweeted, the only white people in the Bible are the ones that killed Jesus. And so all of the problems that you have just described with calling the people who arrived in 1619 black slaves, two words that really each one of them has a whole wealth of kind of anachronisms contained in it. Multiply that 1,000-fold, right, and you get the problem of calling the Roman legates who executed Christ white as compared to everybody else. But
the English would have called them non-white, by the way.
Right, because they were
in the era of the American Revolution.
Yeah,
and later on, Italians were considered swarthy, and Germans, and even people in Scandinavia, which I find quite amusing.
That's great. I'm sure that Scandinavians at this point would be delighted to be referred to as swarthy. It's a compliment.
Must be the Normans, right?
Yeah, that's right. But right, exactly. You kind of the notion of ethnicity, which is a much more kind of, which is actually a concept with a much deeper history, still complicated in terms of the relationship between different ethnicities. But that's, I mean, you the way you describe it, that's almost a fundamentally American notion, the notion that you have an ethnicity in its original sense. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think that's how we've used the term. Now, I don't know what in the 19th century, if there would have been a different term that became what in the 20th century was ethnicity.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is at least a concept, it's rooted in this Greek concept, the ethnos, which is at least something that has coherence to it in terms of culture and people and so forth. I actually would like to, in our remaining time, I'd like to just pivot with you a little bit, because you and I had an interesting email exchange about the ongoing ethnic and racial tensions in America and some of the things that are motivating this present moment of racial unrest. I mean, it's been mentioned several times before that we've had periods of tremendous racial unrest in this country, of course. But you have a kind of interesting, as it were, take on why this particular conflagration. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Can I just add 2 points just on the 1619 project? Two other key turning points. One, our notions of race and slavery don't exist in 1619. Two, they asserted initially that it was common, essentially, for Americans to revolt against the British and to declare independence in order to preserve slavery. That's been thoroughly debunked. Some certainly did, but really a very small number probably. The Times issued a correction, leaves it ambiguous. And then finally, as Bill McClay points out in his essay on the 1619 project, in commentary, it's not 50%, it's more like 5% of the U.S. economy by the time of the Civil War that was connected to slavery. Right? Those are rather important.
Sort of money, yeah. Well, as you point out in the essay, the correction that the Times issued on that first point about how many people revolted with the preservation of slavery as a motivation is a kind of masterclass in studied ambiguity, because it leaves open the possibility that 0.001% of people did so versus anywhere from that to 0.9999999 or 99.9% which is probably much closer to the 0 end of the scale than to the 100 end of the scale. Yeah. But right, so there's that, and then just those naked factual inaccuracies that you raise in the essay are quite staggering. But tell you a lot about how the project works, right? The fact that hasn't
how the Times works nowadays, I fear.
Yeah, exactly, and the Pulitzer Center.
Jones, in a tweet, explicitly said this is not supposed to be a good history. It's supposed to be, she calls it journalism, advancing the agenda. Now, so what she means is she officially rejects the Times slogan of all news fit to print, and also the notion that we report without fear or favor. She explicitly endorses this agenda-driven journalism. So, in other words, I wonder what the Times really thinks of this, that they're not actually following their official credo, if they've noticed that that's what's going on.
Yeah, it's intriguing.
Like pointing out you should change the name in New York. They don't want to think about it.
Yeah. Well, it's right. We began by sort of speculating what might be going through their heads. And it is intriguing because, of course, this is not the only instance. You made reference to Tom Cotton, who caused another little kerfuffle over there by publishing an op-ed. And yeah, I think they increasingly do reject, some of the vanguard of the younger sort of generation over there, the editorial board, increasingly do reject the Standard Times line about how this is supposed to work. And that's, that's kind of a helpful way of thinking through, I think, some of these modern issues, because of course the Nicole Hannah-Joneses of the world, with whom many people at Claremont love to spar online, she's kind of it's bleakly fascinating to watch her self-justify when you engage with her, but they represent, I think, a kind of hyper elite set of ringleaders that are mobilizing a tremendous amount of serious popular unrest, and the popular unrest, it's possible, has very different causes and rationale than the elite sort of theorizing. And it was your ideas about the popular unrest that I was hoping we could get to. What's that about? What are the actual people on the street thinking when they tear down statues?
Right. Well, there are two different things. I wonder. Well, there's two things, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, that's a core group of Marxists who find an issue they can use to try to bring out Marxism. And it's a legitimate injustice, usually is, that helps. But then there are the millions and millions of demonstrators who seem to be increasingly white, and they're trying to show it's still about us protecting others. You can say the line of continuity from the progressives in the early 20th century, who, like Wilson, tended to be racist. Scientific racism was rather big in that era, as was eugenics. And it was not separate from the progressive movement, right? To today, when they wouldn't endorse discrimination in the normal sense of the term. But the condescension and the paternalism remains. These poor dears, we white saviors have to take care of them. So the paternalism remains. But then you have, separately, I think, the Black Lives Matter movement, insofar as it's there's, and also the question of reparations, and where does that come from? And my speculation is that, well, what was affirmative action for? Right after, slavery for a while, then Jim Crow for another century or so. There were serious issues, and you could definitely make the case. So you're going to end Jim Crow and then say, go ahead, fine, catch up. And the argument was, that's not right. You got to help people. But the '64 Civil Rights Act doesn't only say no discrimination against people who are Black. It lists a series of groups who are what the law calls protected classes. And P.S., you can say what we have now in our cultural civil war, we have white guys and protected classes. And those are lines. The law has created lines, just as the Missouri Compromise line separated North and South between places where slavery was okay and places where slavery were not okay. And it deepened and deepened and festered over decades from there. That's why Jefferson's famous letter about the fire bell of the night says you have a marked line with a moral principle. Subjected to the angry passions of men, what's going to happen over time is civil war. That's what he's pointing to. But here we have the line. It wasn't just for African Americans, affirmative action, but America has a special debt to affirmative actions, not to people from Central South America or Asia or elsewhere, right? And yet affirmative action seems more and more to be about helping other groups. Even more than that, at Cornell a few years ago, there was a protest among Black students who were complaining that too many of your students on campus who you've brought in, and presumably faculty as well, who are Black, are actually from Africa or the Caribbean. They are not people who have suffered the legacy of Jim Crow. So in other words, what you have people who understandably think they have, there's something special about them, not normal, that is, America has a special debt to its Black community. But the process, the payments are being made to other people, right? And so if you're going to see, so now in light of intersectionality, in light of affirmative action going to so many different groups, reparations seems to stand out as a means of providing compensation to the actual victims of slavery and Jim Crow, because affirmative action, which was designed to do that, is not about that anymore.
What strikes me as so intriguing about this argument is its direct consequence of the slippage between race and ethnicity that we were talking about earlier on, right? The idea that, or at least that sort of subset of complaints, that things like affirmative action, which were directed at the direct descendants of slavery, or at least those who suffered from the after effects of Jim Crow, had then been expanded out not on the basis of any kind of ethnic or historical idea, but on the basis of a purely racial idea that these people have this color skin and therefore we apply this sort of benefit or what have you. And I think, yeah, that this kind of frustration that the Black struggle in America is constantly being analogized to every other kind of grievance, to the gay rights struggle, to the women's liberation struggle. There's an article in CRB by Mike Gonzalez about the Hispanic, the creation of the category Hispanic, along almost exactly the same lines. So that's, something to chew on, that these kind of erudite philosophical discussions about the historical distinction between race and ethnicity have these very, very concrete ramifications in the here and now.
Yeah, it's very interesting the way it's played out. And of course, there are people, insofar as the Democratic Party has bought into the emerging Democratic majority idea that they will be the coalition of these marginalized groups, it is their interest to multiply them. The consequence of that is assuming they can always stay on the same page. That's why they're very quick to shut things up. I think part of the reason why the term white Hispanic existed, but it was really put on the map with George Zimmerman, was, I'm very cynical about this. I think it was used so this was not a Black versus Hispanic issue. Instead, it became a Black versus white issue because Zimmerman, even though he actually has, as I think as Glenn Reynolds Instapundit puts it, he was more Black than Homer Plessy in his background, right? But he was portrayed as a white Hispanic, so this could be a Black-white issue. So as to avoid any potential conflict between the groups in this coalition that the Democratic Party sees itself as representing. And then you have the white liberals that see themselves on top, and so they have to be better than the other whites. That's essentially what's going on.
Yeah, well, there's
status analysis of race, etc.
Well, there's much to reflect on electorally there as well, I think. I mean, perhaps just to close us out, I will read a little bit from nearing the end of your essay. And because you propose basically kind of the only alternative way of thinking about America that you think is viable in the context of all these sort of competing narratives. And I think it will also have ramifications for coalition building among Republicans going forward. You say, to find a different, more hopeful and helpful tradition, one with a more appealing moral philosophy at its heart, we need only return to 1776. From the start, Americans wrestled with the problem of bringing the idea of equality into practice. In 1783, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts looked at the Declaration of Rights of the recently ratified state constitution and declared that the language "all men are born free and equal" meant an end to slavery in the state. The language came from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, drafted by George Mason, one of Jefferson's sources for the Declaration of Independence. But Virginia would add the qualifier "when they enter into a state of society" to prevent Virginia's courts from doing what Massachusetts' court did. By 1800, all northern states had passed laws ending slavery, and in 1787, the U.S. government banned slavery in the Northwest. So in your view, it seems the real question at hand is sort of what counts as America's DNA, and 1776 for you is the sort of anti-racist DNA of America.
I think one interesting bit is basically Frederick Douglass is almost absent from the 1619 Project. And when he escaped and became an important abolitionist, and he was friendly with William Lloyd Garrison, who was an ardent abolitionist. And what Douglass noticed is Garrison kind of agrees with the Southerners. Is the Constitution, the U.S. government is fundamentally pro-slavery, and therefore the Constitution has to be replaced. So that's kind of the racist DNA argument. And Douglass says, he says, I quote in the article, I think he says something like, "I'm tired of making the South's argument." Right? Realizes that actually that's not a correct reading. And he agrees with Lincoln and Jefferson and others. No, in fact, it is freedom national, slavery is local. Slavery is the exception. The other thing to keep in mind is slavery is the norm in history. It's something like it's existed through all kinds of societies across the world throughout history. What's unusual is anti-slavery. The notion of slavery is simply wrong and no one should be a slave, right? Now, American slavery may have been peculiar or bad because it was based on racial caste. However, it also is, maybe that's related to the fact that we got rid of slavery because in the same underlying conditions that said we absolutized it, then got rid of it, right? But it's very important to remember that's the key thing. And same thing with what's called capitalism, which is really, I think, the term Marx put on the map, describe the market economy. It is ending slavery that is connected with the rise of the free market and the classical liberalism. It is not slavery. Slavery happened to exist. It was the norm. And I think that's rather important. That's the real American tradition, right? That's what sets America apart. Having slavery, even having distinction among what we call ethnic groups now, that's not new, certainly. What's new and different is having freedom for so many, having so many people who are part of the political system, having so many people who can and do own property. That's what's unusual and new. And somehow what gets twisted around is the remnants of the previous system are depicted as the norm, as opposed to what you remember King calls the Declaration of Promissory Note, Martin Luther King, right? That's what we're pointing to. Because you're not going to end slavery everywhere in 1776 when that's the new idea that you're putting into your DNA to grow forth, right? It takes a while, but that's the project. And I do think that's the common basis all of we Americans have. It's what we have to have. It's the only basis upon which America can actually work, I think. Well, the other one will just divide us against each other.
Well, the essay, once again, is called Cancel the New York Times. It is a cogent and stirring defense of the ideology of the American founding, delivered with humor and panache. Richard Samuelson, again, associate professor in American history at California State University, San Bernardino. Look for his forthcoming book on John Adams' political and constitutional thought, Adams and the Republic of Laws. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Likewise. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Close Read, a Claremont Review of Books podcast and a production of the Claremont Institute. Our publisher is Ryan Williams. Our producer is Jake Gannon, and I'm your host, Spencer Clavin. Thanks to Benjamin Squirett for our music. If you liked this episode and you'd like to hear more in-depth interviews based on the Claremont Review of Books, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're available on all major platforms. And if you'd like to support us, we encourage you to leave a 5-star review on iTunes. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you again next time.